Welcome, Peter Bol. Good afternoon. I guess it's good morning where you are. Welcome to this series of talks, interviews with famous sinologists or Chinese historians. My name is Hilde de Weert. I was a student of Peter's a very long time ago. I think I started in 1991 and graduated in 1998. So that's I can't believe how long ago that is now. But, in any case, I'm really glad you accepted this invitation. We're also grateful to Madalena Polly for setting up this series. So, Peter, I'd like to begin with a memory trip back to where your journey into Chinese history really took off. In 1974, you obtained a doctoral diploma from the place where I'm sitting right now. This is Leiden. At the time, it was called Sinology, I think. We call it China Studies now. And perhaps for listeners who are not familiar with a doctoral diploma, this is sort of roughly the equivalent of an MA degree. I guess for someone who grew up in rural New Jersey, it wasn't all that common to travel all the way to provincial Leiden to do a degree in Chinese studies. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that came about?
I can. And so I grew up in various places, but when I was, I guess, 8 or 9 years old, my family moved to New Jersey. But it was, you notice my last name is a Dutch last name. And my father, in fact, his family had immigrated when he was a child to the United States. And so we grew up hearing about Holland, but not ever being there. And I'll get to that in a minute. But it was also a very political family, left-wing family. And I was interested in China because I was interested in politics. And so my initial interest as a high school student was in China as a socialist country, because socialism was good, right? And the United States didn't recognize China and pretended it didn't exist and was, supported the fascist Chiang Kai-shek and so on. So I began, as a high school student, I began to study Chinese. There was a summer program for high school students, which I was able to go to, and I began to learn Chinese language. And then when I graduated from high school, rather than going to Columbia, where I was going to go to college, I went with my family to Holland. And we had met the professor Holsue, who had been visiting Princeton University. My family lived in the countryside outside of Princeton. And he said, Jonge, he said, if you come to Holland, he said, you moet als student live as a Dutch student, and come in op kamers, get a room in Leiden and attend classes. So that's what I did. And then he said, midway through, he said, I was still, very gung-ho and working hard. And then he said, would you like to stay here? And so I said, why not? Why not? Inertia than anything else. Of course, education in Leiden in those days was very much in a classical tradition, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. You mentioned Hulsue, and I was sort of wondering what Chinese studies would have been like. This is, I guess
China, I will tell you what Chinese studies was
70s, like. Yeah.
For Chinese studies, we had 13 examinations. All of them were oral, right? There was no written work involved at all. And with the exception of the examination in Japanese history and in Chinese history, because we also had to learn some Japanese, all the examinations were translation examinations. So you would go in and you'd see we had a syllabus of books to read and articles to read in Chinese. And you'd go in and the professor would say, open to page 23, third line, start to translate. And you'd translate. right? And then he might ask questions. Why do you say that? What does this word mean? And so on.
But I hope that at that point, at least the readings were somewhat updated. I realized that this had been going on for a long time, but it used to be the case that a lot of the readings were focused on colonial Indonesia, for example, where there's a Chinese community that had to be served.
We weren't being prepared for the Secret Service of, minding the Chinese in Indonesia anymore. But we were, the newspaper readings was Brandkrant, Conrad Brandt's book on 1930s or 40s newspapers. What was interesting was it was such a smorgasbord of different texts. I was not a good student, to be sure. I was not been trained in classical languages. I was not a good student. But the exposure to the range of texts, to read Lucian at the same time you're reading Mencius, to read Hu Shi's Baihua at the same time you're reading Guwen Guanshi or the Hanshu or things like this. That's really was quite extraordinary. And that kind of education, of course, is, I'm afraid, long gone. Mm-hmm. And although I was a bad student, I was exposed in a way to this broad reading that across the dynasties and across genres, right? And so you read everything, read a bit of everything. That was, although I was interested in history. And what happened was that there was no spoken Chinese class, of course, because you didn't need that for a classical. And there was no writing, so you didn't have to write anything. And eventually I became a bit of a wastrel. But at a certain moment...
Some of that, I guess, did have an impact. If I think about your own approach to,
And one Zurchiel was persuaded at one point to give a seminar. And I remember he did one seminar on teaching us a textual filiation using the Lao Tzu Dao De Jing as a case. And another seminar was on is appropriate to your background, which your background is a modern political version of the going up the river at the Qingming Festival, Qingming Shanghe. And we actually had a seminar which read not only Jacques Zernet's China on the Eve of the Mongol Invasion, which uses many Southern Song texts about Hangzhou, but also Dongjing Menghua Lu, et cetera, et cetera. And what I was fascinated by was here is this world that Marco Polo enters, right? And through which is extraordinary, beyond imagination, right?
It's interesting. So I didn't realize this, but in fact, sort of the focus on Song history and Song text was already part of your undergraduate education in that case.
Yeah, because it fit my political purpose, which was how do we make the Western world take China seriously? So in any case, so there I was in Holland, and at a certain moment, I lost all my spoken Chinese because of non-use, and I decided I got to get out of here. So after I passed my first degree, was in those days called the Kandidats, I left for Taiwan and spent my time in Taiwan, and then came back in '74 and did the doctoral.
To finish. Oh, okay. So there was some time in between. You mentioned at some point, so you had Dutch origins, but nevertheless, you grew up in the United States. And as perhaps this is important to point out to listeners as well, I am based at Leiden, but I myself am a foreigner here. So at least somebody who's perceived to have an accent, even though I'm a native Dutch speaker. That sort of makes me wonder as well what it was like to be an international American student in the Netherlands at the time.
Well, I think once I began to learn a bit of Dutch, it became easier, right? But it was, I think at that point, there was a great deal of interest in trying to make sure that Dutch students were international themselves, that there weren't enough jobs to be had in Holland in our field, right? There were 11 people in my class, of whom only 4 finished the doctoral.
So, but I guess all classes were held in Dutch. Is that?
Yeah, but sometimes in English and Dutch. And I remember Josue saying at the beginning of the semester, look to your right, look to your left. By the time those people will not be here. There is no, it is geen toekomst. There's no future in these studies, no jobs. But that meant be prepared to leave the country too.
Yeah.
Go in other fields. So some people became professors, right? Leonard Blusset, the professor of European expansion. Others stayed on teaching, Mansfeld Beck, for example, who worked in Han history. Others, Wim Boot became professor in Japanese studies.
Oh, okay.
Some people went into the foreign service. Philippe de Heer, for example, who's a couple of years behind me, became secretaris from the Koning. The others went on, and Remmelink, for example, went on to the Dutch-Japan office in Tokyo. So yeah, there was
people left. So that actually clarifies sort of one of the things that I wanted to ask as well. It's clear that you decided not to stay in Leiden, but what you're saying, sort of, this was suggested also. Please go and explore the field. But on the other hand,
one of the people who came, there were people who came from abroad to study in Leiden, from Germany, also from the United States. So the famous Michel Strickman came to Leiden to get degrees. And of course, he could just do the course, because you could do your exams whenever you wanted to, remember.
Convenience.
And you didn't have to go to college. You didn't have to take the classes. All you had to do was do the exams. The classes never covered all the material you would do in your exams. It only covered maybe a third of it or a fifth of it. So you'd have to go and prepare the rest yourself, and then you'd go and do your examination.
It's interesting, and that in some parts of Europe, this is actually still the case. I think we've definitely changed in this regard, but I think places like
But Lloyd Haft, who ended up teaching modern Chinese literature at Leiden, was an American and interested in poetry, and in fact became thoroughly Dutch, is in many ways Dutch, and writes his poetry in Dutch. Right?
That's right. So, but after graduating in 1974 or so, what were your immediate plans? Did you think?
To go to, I had already been admitted to, I'd been in Taiwan from 72, January of 72 to 74. And I went back to Taiwan, in fact. But I had been applied to PhD programs in America, and I kept putting them off because I was studying the classics, the 4 books and 5 classics in Taiwan. And, I'd get ready to leave, and I'd been admitted to these PhD programs. And I'd be getting ready to leave, and my teacher would say, yes, he said, it's such a pity you're going to go after all. You've just finished the 4 books, but you haven't started on the 5 classics yet. And so he said, put it off for a year. So I put it off for a year. And then the next year, yes, time to go. Pity you have to go. He said, but he says, you've only read, you haven't read the Chunsho yet. You can't really understand China without reading the Chunsho. And I put it off again. And then he said, well, you have to read, if you've read the Chunsho, but you haven't read the I Ching, you don't understand anything. Chunsho and I Ching are Husham Gaoli, are inside and outside to each other. And so I said, okay, Lao, sure. But James said, I have to go. I'm really going to go this time. And so that was, of course, the famous Yu Lao, Aishin Juelo Yu Yun, whose reputation after his death is even better than during his lifetime.
How so?
Well, because, his students, he had many, many, many students, mainly Chinese students who came at night, and a few American students. There are a number of them. And the students always took notes, extensive notes. And those notes have been compiled. They have in books so I was in a bookshop in Sichuan in Chengdu, and I came across books with his commentaries on the 4 books published, right, in China. He has a Shuyuan, an academy that his disciples have continued, that meets on a regular basis. and many, hundreds of meetings and speeches and talks and things like this. So in that sense, but he was his reputation has lived on. But he was interesting because for him, the Chinese, the texts, the Confucian texts, were a valid and real template for looking at the world. Right? For him to read the classics was to read the things that were absolutely relevant to thinking about the present. And that, I think what I was learning from that, because, Josue had also said, young man, he said, young men, he said, there were almost all men, a few women. He said, social economic history is the future. But I really wasn't interested in social economic history. I was interested actually in political institutional history, but I was interested in the fact that if you want to understand how the choices people make, you need to understand what they think their choices are and how they understand the problems they face. And when I was starting to spend my time studying the classics and not returning to Holland, I would write to Josue once a year or once every half year. And he said to me, why are you staying there? What are you doing? You don't need that kind of knowledge anymore. And I said, well, if you can imagine somebody who was Chinese person doing medieval European history, would you think it would be a good idea for them to read the Bible? Right? And he said, well, yeah, okay, I can see that parallel. And I think there is a parallel there, that the text which we define our knowledge that serve us as real you may not think the great learning, the Dashue, the 8 steps of the Dashue, from investigating things to bringing peace to the world, is realistic. But if you think it is, if you think that those 8 steps are the proper order of things, then that provides a valid way by which you can locate your activities.
Yeah, but this is a good point to sort of pick up, because in Taiwan, you were reading the 4 books, parts of the classics, but ultimately when you went to Princeton, you started a project that really sort of was intended to map out the intellectual landscape of the 11th century.
Right.
So where did the switch come from? So why intellectual history, but also why this particular period in time?
So 2 things happened. Remember, I was an historian, not a philosopher, right? So my entry into Chinese thought came from historical interest, and to some extent political historical interest rather than philosophical interest or literary interest. But it seemed to me that what I became interested in was, I didn't know the name for it, but it had to do with the idea that people's values are important to the choices they make. And in politics, people make choices, thus look at the values of people who have political power, right? To understand the choices they make. And so if you think, since I was interested in the Tang-Sung transition, I was interested in the Sung dynasty, it seemed to me that the largest question in what I realized should be called intellectual history for the Sung dynasty was, how do we account for the rise of Neo-Confucianism? The second part of that was, but there's also a social transition from the great clan society of the Tang to the literati examination civil service society of the Sung. And shouldn't these 2 things be connected? Now, I didn't have a good answer to that at first, but the way I structured my dissertation project was to ask the following question. We know that from the vantage point of later times, that the most important intellectual force in the 11th century were the Chung brothers, Zhou Deni, Zhang Zai, Shaoyong, people like that. The natural philosophers who laid the foundation for Neo-Confucianism, or Dao Xue, the learning of the way, Li Xue, the learning of coherence of principle. But in their own time, they were marginal. they were not the mainstream. They became the mainstream after the fact. They were read back in as they were made the mainstream by people like Jushi. So I asked the following question: who was the mainstream? What defined the mainstream, right? And that's the point at which I began to see that this thing that they called Wen and Wenxue, the literary, the cultural, the civil, that this was really at the mainstream. And in fact, that people like the Chung brothers were agitating, or Zhou Duni were agitating against literary concerns even more than they were agitating against Buddhism. Because within the literati world they were part of, the literary concerns people had that bothered them the most, right? That they saw as an impediment to being a moral person, to self-cultivation, to learning to become a sage, and so on. And so I said, well, if they're marginal and the literary is more at the mainstream, who could we look at that would clue us into that? And the obvious people are Oyo, right? Wang Anshe to a large extent too. And Su Shi. Su Shi was interesting because he was of the same generation as the Chung brothers. And Su Shi had followers too, just as the Chung brothers had followers. And the nice thing was that his followers were not only writing poetry, but were writing a great deal in prose and extensive prose essays. And Su Shi himself was, and of course his brother and his father, but was writing commentaries on the classics, on the Book of Change, on the Book of Documents, and on the Analects, the last one being lost. Now, that is, and so that was my dissertation.
That was a dissertation.
People were ignored.
It indeed focused on Su Shi and then
his followers
or so. So it's an 11th century project. But if you then look at the book that came out of it, The Sculpture of Hours or Suwen, it is a rather different kind of work where it at the same time sort of does these close readings of generations of scholars, including still Su Shi, but it has expanded to encompass Tang and other Song literati. And to me, this struck me as a fairly distinctive approach. So to combine at the same time a very broad scope, temporal scope, cross-dynastic also, Tang to Song, which I think was not common, but still combine it with the sort of close reading of all sorts of text, pretty much the entire oeuvre of those people. So why, it was already a comprehensive dissertation, so why go beyond that for the first book?
Well, so I had been writing articles after the dissertation. When people would invite me to a conference, I'd write an article that seemed to me to speak to the issues I was interested in. So I eventually wrote an article, for example, on Changyi as a literatus, not as a philosopher, but the ways in which he was part of the literati society, on Wang Anshe and Sima Guang, and so on. And so when I went to I sat down and I realized I had to turn the translation into a book. And so what began as a introductory chapter, and the first chapters was actually meant to just be part of a quick introduction, except I then proceeded to look at the Quan Tang one and amounts of that. And so Hanyu and what made Hanyu different in his time, but what was early Tang like? And it just went on and on. And at a certain moment, I realized that, well, this is, I'm already at 300 or 400 pages, and that's only supposed to be the introduction. And so this will not work.
And the time-year clock was ticking, I imagine.
I better start to divide this up into something more manageable. And that's the point at which, so two things then happened. I'd say one is because I was at Harvard getting to know Steve Owen, and who I think is still the most brilliant thinker on Chinese literature outside of China and Japan. And the other was having knowing people, friends who were social historians, particularly Bob Hartwell, but then some of his students, the whole range of students, Paul Smith, Bob Himes, Linda Walton, Hugh Clark, and so on, and seeing that they actually had a kind of a solution to the problem, fundamental problem, big problem I was interested in, which is how are social change and intellectual change related? If there's a transition in the nature of the Shi, how does this relate to the rise of Neo-Confucianism, of Chengzhu Neo-Confucianism? And so the book, This Culture of Ours, becomes a kind of a way of addressing that, from looking at the transition from Wen Xue, if you will, to Dao Xue as the central, as the mainstream of literati thinking about values.
Okay, but so you weren't satisfied with the history of Neo-Confucianism that you had written in your first book. You continued, right? And to me, it's a surprising choice in a way. If you think about it, Neo-Confucianism, the history of social cultural elites, they're not particularly sexy, popular subjects in our field. So why continue to write a second voluminous book on the history of the rise and spread of Neo-Confucianism? For readers who are not familiar with this, the second book is Neo-Confucianism in History. So I'm interested in your personal choice, but I'm also interested, what do you think, why you think we should be reading about the history of Neo-Confucianism?
So first of all, it never occurred to me to worry about whether it was popular or not, right? When I was doing my dissertation, one of my teachers, James Liu Zhejian, great historian of the 11th century, really, sort of political intellectual historian. When I told him that my dissertation was going to be about Su Shi and this issue of Wen and why Wen was so important, he looked at me and said, "It's not important." And he said, "That's a nonsense, that's stupid for a dissertation. That's totally irrelevant." And I said, no. I said, I can have all this evidence that is relevant and it's important. He said, "No, it's not." And at a certain moment, I said to me, "How do you know it's irrelevant?" And he said, "Because I'm Chinese." And what can you say? I mean, there's no answer to that. Another professor said to me, "Why don't you say to him, but you're not an 11th century Chinese?" I think that's crucial, because for James Liu, the study of the 11th century, particularly of Wang Anshi or Yangshuo, was in order to provide guidance to China in the 20th century. That was the purpose of history.
But that is true for a lot of intellectual historians, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it wasn't for me. What I wanted to do was understand how China changed, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter if it's people think it's popular or not, or it's. What's important from my perspective is we come to terms with, or that we recognize that for a long period of Chinese history, right, these ideas and these texts and these assumptions had enormous impact on Chinese history because they informed cultural and political elites. And it's not that I think the ideas are right. I mean, it's the reason why this culture of ours, as a translation of Siwan, is in quotes, is because I couldn't say that culture of theirs, right? Mm-hmm. It's not my culture. I'm an outsider looking at it, and I don't identify with it. But it's important, and it doesn't matter if we like it or not. If it's important, we have to deal with it. War is important. It has consequences. Doesn't mean we have to like war to study war, right?
Yeah. Well, since you already brought up sort of a comparison with medieval Europe, sort of reading the Bible as sort of, this would be what you need to know in order to understand what is being talked about in a lot of medieval intellectual history. Would it be fair to draw a comparison here as well and say that, you need to know Neo-Confucianism just as you need to know something about Christianity or Protestant ethic in order to understand?
Yeah, sure. Right. Yes, indeed. But there is another element too. I mean, I think it's also useful to look at Europe through the lens of China and realize that Thomas Aquinas was the Jushi of, so to speak, the Jushi of the West, or something like this, and going the other direction. But the other part of it,
and the Martin Luther at the same time.
Well, I'm going to put Martin. Wei Ming wanted, of course, Martin Luther to be Wang Yangming. So it's a forced comparison, obviously. But there was another element to this, Hilde, that I wanted to get across, was that the idea that Neo-Confucianism was merely a pillar of the autocratic state, right, struck me as being profoundly wrong. And that it failed to recognize the role of Neo-Confucianism as once a defender of the existence of the state, but also its critic, right? And so that I wanted to make sure that people understood that the Neo-Confucian view of politics was one in which literati had the right to speak. They did not accept the argument of 不在其位不谋其政. If you don't have the appropriate political position, you may not speak, right? You may not criticize. No, criticism and learning went together. And at the same time, of course, Neo-Confucians are deeply committed to notions of unity, which, is sort of the Chinese secular, the literati secular religion, right? That everything is somehow fundamentally one and coherent. It ought to be. Okay. I wanted to recognize both those qualities.
An important point, and I want to link that to the next item that I would like to pick up, and that's teaching, because it seems to me that what you've done there has had an impact also on the work of many of your students. But teaching has occupied a central place in your professional career. I think it would be fair to say that at Harvard, you have been a very well-regarded teacher. I think those of us who co-taught with you remember very well the Rice Paddy's course, called Rice Paddy's because it covered Chinese history from its beginnings to the early 20th century. It was also known as the Yao Tu Ma course. Perhaps that has changed now. But at the time, this course received high marks from students who were majoring in fields in just about anything we can imagine. And in recent years, you've also expanded your interest in teaching to reach out also beyond the walls of Harvard College itself to audiences across the world, and also as Vice Chancellor for Advances in Learning between roughly 2013 and 18. You played a leading role in Harvard Acts, ensuring that also courses in Chinese history and the Chinese humanities became part of Harvard's MOOCs offerings.
Right.
And particularly the course also co-taught with Bill Kirby, China Acts, sort of a model MOOC course that Harvard produced. So I want to ask a series of questions about teaching, sort of just to sort of highlight how important a part of your career this has been. And perhaps to start out with a fairly broad question is, what is good teaching from your perspective? When is it successful?
So this is a little bit unfair, but I'll put it like this. When I was a student in Holland, it struck me that the education, the kind of education we had, read text, translate text, was no thought, right? When I went to Taiwan to study with Yu Lao, the teacher did the thinking, and you listened and took notes, and you could ask questions to hear more of his thinking. And when I went as a graduate student to Princeton, I think one of the most exciting class I had was with Willard Peterson in early intellectual history, where he expected the students to do the thinking. And it was like liberation. I've never been able to do what he did, which is basically shut up and listen to the students. But I can say that I've always learned that Harvard is a major program in graduate studies. And so it's not only undergraduate teaching, it's also graduate teaching. And graduate teaching means students writing papers and reading them carefully. And you learn a lot from your students. So you're exposed to all the things they want. And in China, you have to write a dissertation in the field of your advisor, even if you're not terribly interested in it. And in America, that's simply not the case. And so I've had students write across the board from Tang, Sung, Yuan, Ming, not in Xing, but Tang, Sung, Yuan, Ming, and history, religion, all intellectual history, rituals, all sorts of things. And think about your work, which also drew. Like you, I have a broad interest in bibliography and looking at many works, many different kinds of books. And so that's always been, graduate teaching has been really central and important, but it also takes a lot of time. And at one point I had something like 18 graduate students, and that was just,
I remember when we held this, what was it, 65th anniversary, your 65th anniversary, we did a symposium, we had a large group of students to invite. I think none of us had realized how far this had expanded, indeed covering anything from up the 6th to the 19th century.
Yeah. But let's talk about.
Can I ask one follow-up question on this? Because I think people who may be watching this may include graduate students. Do you have any advice for them? Things that they should take on board when applying or working their way through graduate school? Do what you care about. Study the questions that you don't have answers to, that you are interested in, and that you think are important. And don't worry if your advisors say it's not important. Your job is to persuade them that it is important, right? I think that trying to trim your sails to fit the wind is in the end leaves you at the mercy of the wind. And so better to steer your own boat. May I sort of just ask another follow-up question on this, because I think there may be another side to this as well, that it's certainly an offering, saying you come up with the ideas, but is it perhaps also an expectation that you don't want a student who comes and asks, what should I work on? That you expect to have someone present their own project essentially and persuade you that it's worthwhile doing.
That's right. Philip Kuhn once said to me, sometimes he said, you have to tell the student, you have to give them their topic. In my view, I never agreed with that. It seemed to me that if you don't have a topic, why do it? Just to get a PhD? You're not going to be happy with that in the end. So,
okay.
You got to figure it out for yourself.
I would agree with that, actually. I think that's, if you want.
But let's talk about undergraduate teaching, because I thought I was actually, it turned out I was very good at lecturing on Chinese history, less good perhaps at leading a discussion section. My colleague, Bill Kirby, with whom I've taught Chinese history for a long time, is extremely good at leading discussions, right? In class and doing case studies. And I'm much better at giving lectures that open things up for students and show them things they hadn't thought of before. And of course, my colleague, Michael Pewitt, is extraordinary at that. So I'm somewhere in between all of these, sort of in the middle. But I guess in teaching, what you want is you want students to understand. And you can tell when students understand or not, right? You can tell from the audience, from the way they respond, whether you're holding their attention, whether they're following your line of argument. And so that's, that I think is what teaching is about, is you have something to say. I mean, I'm not doing a textbook. I'm trying to develop arguments and ideas students can ponder.
But to follow up on that as well, so you say one of the important things is capturing students' attention and making sure they understand. Has this changed? You've been teaching for 30 more years or so. I can imagine that this has, even this modest goal perhaps, has become more challenging as time has progressed.
Well, I think that, there's been a change. I don't think I've changed my attitude very much, but it's certainly true that student expectations have changed. So when I began teaching, you could expect undergraduates to read 200 to 300 pages a week for a course. That is not possible at the present. For some students it is. The vast majority of students will not do that. Right? And if you cut it down and say, okay, I'll give you 50 pages, but spend 3 hours reading it and really pay attention, they'll say, no, I can read 50 pages in 20 minutes. I can do that quickly. So there we have a problem. We have a problem, right? So that brings us, I think, to one of the things that goes on with MOOCs, with these massive open online courses. Is the key to a MOOC is not that it's online, it's that it's interactive with the student. I'll explain what I mean, but I'll go back to, so we had the Chinese history course, and we had a website for it just at the beginning when websites were starting to appear. And we had the idea that we should have a website that offered many different ways of looking at the material, and that if we also taped lectures, we could put them on the website. And Natasha Heller, who's now a professor of Buddhist studies, a professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia, was really the person who did this, to develop a website that we could use for the course. And it had everything from, looking at one part of the country and listening to its distinctive music, its architecture, and so on, and dress and language. But what we discovered was that the people who were most interested in the website were not Harvard students, but people outside of Harvard, where it was being picked up by lots of people and passed around. And we looked at that, and so why is this? It's because the Harvard students were only interested in doing the assignment. What do I need to do to get through this course? Right?
And get an A.
That's typical student behavior. That's typical student behavior. These are your demands. I can meet your demands, and I can move on and keep more time to myself. They're not there visiting. They're working, right? So that gets us to an online course, because what the MOOC did, and this is why when Harvard began to do it, I said, and persuaded Bill Kirby to go along with this, that we'll take our course, if you'll give us the support, we will make a MOOC out of our Chinese history course. Because the MOOC is based on the principle of what's called chunk and test, right? Besides learning outcomes, which is a good idea for everything. It says you give people a little bit of information, either it's a video, it's reading, it's a problem, it's whatever, and then you ask them questions. To keep them paying attention, they have to be playing a role. And they may be answering questions for which they get a right or wrong answer, or they may be having to contribute to a forum and talk with other students online and see what other students have to say. And so we developed, or Harvard X had all these possibilities. We developed, it was right at the beginning of Harvard X. No one controlled us. We just kept producing. We basically reproduced our whole course, which at that point had 3 hours of lecture a week and readings. And once it became check and test, it became impossibly longer. I ended up, I think, at 180 hours. It's the longest MOOC that's ever been done. And so we had to divide it into 10 mini courses. But it had a following, and we still get people who write to us and say, this has been, a transformative experience for
great. the MOOC was, of course, just one part of your involvement in working with digital media and digital methods throughout the 90s and the 2000s. Digital methods transformed how we worked. Right. And I think it's fair to say that very early on, you became sort of a leading figure in digital projects that have been transforming our fields. I'm thinking in particular of the China Biographical Database Project, CHDIS, but there are others as well. And so can you tell us a little bit about how and why you decided to invest in those sorts of projects?
Yeah, which have taken a lot of my time too. So the story that is actually meeting and talking to Bob Hartwell, a professor at University of Pennsylvania, much disliked by many of the faculty at Princeton because he was not a sinologist. He was really a social economic historian. But except for Willard Peterson, who became my advisor, who pointed out that Hartwell actually had written on intellectual history as well. It was tremendously in all sorts of problems. And so Hartwell is a really interesting figure. At the same time, I couldn't type well. And in those days, you had to produce a finished manuscript, type, no mistakes, and a carbon copy. And I could not type a page without mistakes. And it turned out that there was this thing called a line editor on a mainframe computer, and you could get some hours. Everyone had the right to 5 hours on that or something like this. And you could go and write your dissertation on that, and then you could correct your mistakes and print it out. That was extraordinary. It didn't have spell check or things like this, but it had all these other features. And so I would collect hours from other people because other people didn't do this. And I had all these hours and I did my dissertation on that. Even though they ended up with lots of errors still, typos and still. But when I was serving on the joint committee of the American Council of Learned Societies and Social Science Research Council, which funded projects, Chinese studies projects, and Bob Hartwell asked for money to do an historical GIS of China. Not for much, I think $25,000. And this became an issue at a meeting. And the question was, well, what is this stuff? What is this all about? And Bob Marks and I volunteered to go to Washington, University of Washington, where Bob Hartwell was meeting with other people there who did GIS stuff, right? And Bill Skinner was already involved in that as well. And we went up to sort of look and say, is this real? Is this worth investing in? And it wasn't flim flam. Bob was doing it all himself. But it was it was real. It was real. And so we went back and said, give him the money. And he did. And Bob eventually, showed me what he was doing with this and then showed me his other historical projects. And at one point he said, I'm going to write Harvard into my will so that somebody will take on these digital projects if I die. And can I do that? And I said, sure. I mean, first of all, a couple of things. He was young. He wasn't going to die. Secondly, I knew from stories and from experience that Bob would like people a lot and then turn against them. And so I knew that of the moment he liked me a lot, because I really took his work seriously and thought it was valuable. And because when I was writing that first book, I actually paid attention to social history and his work. But I knew he would stop liking me. And he did, sure enough. He did. He got very angry with me when I said I was going to have a computer scientist at Harvard look at the coding for his database. Now, how dare I do that? Okay. And so he was just so angry. And so that was that. And then, a year or two later, he died. And he died before changing his will. And since he had incorporated his software into a company, a business, his idea was that every university would give him $225,000 to do his work. So he'd make tons of money, he'd have, et cetera. Because he had left University of Pennsylvania, living in Wyoming. And then he died. His wife then proceeded to die within a year. And probate courts went to Harvard. Well, it turned out not to be Harvard, it turned out to be Harvard Imaging Institute. And we ended up with this, and I found out about it. And I went to the Harvard Imaging Institute and said, we have a moral obligation to do something with this. And so the first thing we did was to take up the historical GIS, because I knew that was a real thing. People were doing it. A lot of people around the world were beginning to do that in Chinese studies, mainly contemporary, but also that Fudan University had the capability of building a GIS, or one person could do the GIS, but they had the historical geographers. And it occurred to me that if we all could agree to work together and build a common foundational GIS for Chinese history, from Qin Shi Huang, 221 BCE to 1911, the Xinhai Revolution, Xinhai Gumi, that we could probably go to a funder and say, look, this is going to be it. We're going to do this for Chinese history. Of course, by that point, we had the Great Britain Historical GIS, and you had these European projects which were map-based. And we couldn't base it on maps for China. We had to base it on historical geography. And that's why the Fudan Center for Chinese Historical Geography was so important. And the Luce Foundation, bless their soul, with Kit Luce as chairman of the board, who became fascinated by this, gave us the wherewithal, significant wherewithal, for Fudan to work for a number of years. And then National Endowment for the Humanities chipped in, and so on. And we were able to proceed with this project. It didn't get as far as we had thought it could, but it did get pretty far, and it still is now actually the most authoritative in terms of locations of places and things like this, GIS. But as you have to keep reminding people, a GIS is a database, it's not a map, right? You have to have software, you have to have the software read the database and so on in order to generate maps. So gradually, I think we've seen, when we did it, we were so far ahead of where people in our field were for history, right? People doing modern stuff, contemporary stuff, wasn't social science types, they could do this sort of thing. But for history, we were the only people who did it, the people who were involved in the project.
No, and I can imagine, I can imagine that for something like a GIS, the project is an easier sell. I think people can easily relate to, you can produce data that then can be used for a variety of purposes, because you can sort of do a spatial analysis of a variety of phenomena. Now, the other project that you took on early on, the China Biographical Database, I saw a little bit of that history, and to me that seemed like one where initially there were quite a few challenges, not only in terms of the practical challenges, but also, that it was very hard to convince people that this was actually worth doing. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges, but also sort of why you pushed through and how you overcame those challenges?
So
I think by now it is accepted.
I should go back and say that with Bob Hartwell's historical GIS, we abandoned that and built an entirely new one, right? Because of the method he used, which is based on co-location with contemporary administrative places, didn't work. And Fudan really, really thought that it had to be a new thing from the ground up. The GIS work began in 2000, and in 2000, I knew that we needed to do something with his biographical database. I didn't know how. It ran on a program that ran within a Windows operating environment, but it was not online. It wasn't really shareable. It was, one person would have to enter all the data. And I also knew that Bob was trusted to his memory a lot and worked very quickly. And so the question was always, what's the error rate going to be in his work? And so the first issue was, how do we take what he's done, which had around 20,000 people in it. First of all, we had to get the program figured out, right? And Michael Fuller was really important to that because he could read Chinese and he knew programming. And then we had to get people to work through and correct it. And there we did two things. The first thing, we wanted Academia Sinica, the Institute for History and Philology, which is then being directed by Professor Huang Quanchun, who's a Sung historian. And Hartwell's database, by the way, was a Sung database, 20,000 Sung people. And the other person was at Peking University, because we wanted both centers for Chinese studies to be involved, right? And not just one or the other. It was Professor Deng Xiaonan at Peking University, who had spent a year at Penn studying with Bob Hartwell. And so we went to Professor Deng and said, would you be willing to have your students work on this if we could supply the funding? Just, 8 hours a week for your students and just going through and correcting it. And they did, and Fang Chengfeng, who's now a professor at Tsinghua University, was the first project manager for that there. And at Harvard, Chen Sung, who's now a professor at Bucknell, Sung Chen was the project manager. But doing this manually, and I should add that Liu Liyan, Lao Napian at Institute for History and Philology persuaded the Institute that they should invest in putting this online, right? With a query system and entry system online, which they did. Although that's now being replaced. And in fact, the database has gone from 20,000 to 470,000. It's been overhauled and redesigned, et cetera, et cetera. So Michael Fuller is really the architect of that redesign. And now Wang Hongsu is the project manager, the senior project manager for it. The key to the database became a conversation I had with a professor of computer science here at Harvard, Stuart Schieber. And I told him what we were doing. And he said, how do you extract data from your texts? Because we had digital text. Wang Di's, the indexed Sung biographical sources had been converted to a corrected, updated digital text at Academia Sinica. And they had given us that to use at Beida, at Peking University, to correct the database. And I said, well, we have people doing this manually, but by my count, it's going to take us 80 years, right, to get this done. And we're working. And he said, yes, there are computational methods for this. Have you heard of regular expressions? Have you heard of named entity recognition? I said, regular expressions, like, hello. He said, no. That's not what it means. And he explained what a regular expression was. He explained recall and precision. He explained tagging. And he said, if you have some funding, I have a graduate student. She doesn't know Chinese, but she knows this sort of stuff, and she can work with you. And so Alif Yamangil, a graduate student of his who now works, I believe, at Google, came in and along with Chen Sung, we began to, and with a grant in this case from Harvard, we began to work on how we would use regular expressions and named entity recognition to extract data from texts. Right? Now, you know a lot about that because eventually, as we figured this out, you figured this out too, and you did an online Marcus system for letting people upload their texts and use some of our code tables, for example, to tag it. And at the same time, we developed, when Chen Shipei was here as a project manager before she left to for Max Planck Institute, and a young fellow from the University of Macau who had been a fellow student at Taida, William Peng, we developed a system for tagging local gazetteer data, which now is at the Max Planck Institute, has been developed in something called LogArt, the local gazetteer research tools system. But that began with CBDB here at Harvard when they were working on it.
Well, one of the things that strikes me in this conversation is that Chen Song, and myself,
all these other people,
we're all students, right? So I'm wondering also to what extent does the participation in these projects transform your own teaching? Do you feel that these methodologies need to be integrated in your teaching? And if so, at what levels do you do this?
Yeah. So it certainly allowed me to do my own maps for teaching. In teaching, I felt uneasy about forcing this on students. I think that digital humanities is going to become a necessary part of the toolkit of students. But I've also known that using it in my research is one thing, but demanding that students do it is a different thing. And although I taught some graduate courses on these techniques early on, I realized that I didn't have the kind of expertise that we needed. And so luckily we were able to bring Donald Sturgeon here for a number of years, and now Kwok Long Tang. And these are people who both are interested in building things. Donald Sturgeon, of course, is famous for C-text. People who are interested in teaching as well. And so that's been our goal. Chen Sung came here for a year and also taught to really to build up the courses so that students who want to use this in their dissertation research can. And we've had a number of students start to do that. And we have students at the moment who are doing that. And more graduate students come in, already have part of the toolkit under their belt, so to speak. So I think that's going to become more and more part of it. The other part of it, which I really would want to emphasize, is that it's two things. First of all, in the future, if we're going to keep training students in graduate school, we have to look beyond academic jobs as career options. Right? And there was a time in the 50s, 60s, 70s when half of the PhDs would go on to non-academic jobs. But as the academic market squeezed, the value of academic jobs became higher and more students felt that's the only thing they should do. We have to get back to the going to work for banks, working for public history, going to archives, historical societies, museums, and so on. And the second thing is that digital humanities is a way to make that breakthrough, because there are more digital humanities jobs now. It's the biggest growth area in the humanities. Go to digital humanities jobs online and you will see over 1,000 jobs available, right? Across the world, in museums, in academic positions, in historical societies, in archives, in local governments, and so on. There's tremendous demand if you have the knowledge, if you have the techniques. So that, I think, is really has to be an important part of the future. And but whether it has to be part of your research or not is another question. Ideally, it's going to allow you, I would say this, it allows for people who are interested in dealing with lots of data, whether it's textual data or whether it's prosopographical data or whatever it is. Digital humanities techniques are wonderful. If you're going to simply read a set of documents deeply, it's not clear to me that you need to do that unless you want to see them in the context of the language of the time, in which case you actually need how to do things use things like the contemporary methods for doing topic modeling, BERT, for example, B-E-R-T. Well, that's going to allow you to take the few things you're reading and see them within the context of other things written at the time. So it's not inimical to close reading and deep reading. And so, I think that Moretti is right. Distant reading and close reading are perfectly compatible. But there's certainly resistance to it, right? It doesn't replace, it adds new questions, new things we can do. It doesn't take away the old things we were doing and the traditional things we were doing. So.
Yeah, I think about this quite similarly. It's sort of one way to deal with this question of how do I contextualize my work in a broader set of texts and practices. We've said quite a bit about the digital, but I wanted to bring up one other aspect of your teaching that always fascinated me. I came too late. I was always a bit jealous of my fellow graduate students who managed to go on a field work trip with you to Tsinghua.
Hilde, you came too early. You came.
Yes. That was sort of the idea that too late in the sense that my time had already passed, or too early indeed in terms of my graduation. I want to know a little bit more about that also in terms of how useful an experience you thought this was for yourself and for the students, whether this is something you would recommend that historians do more generally, sort of incorporate a fieldwork trip for business graduate student training.
Yeah. So I have been teaching this seminar on local cultural history because no one was doing it here, and in part also to create demand for hiring a social historian. Eventually we got, of course, Michael Soni, who really does field work. And I had been teaching that seminar, and then I taught it for a number of years, and my colleagues in Japan who had been to Jinhua, they said, there's no point in going. There's nothing there. There's nothing to see. But Americans, when you talk to Americans and they say, have you been there? And the answer no bothers them a lot, right? It's like studying classical language without learning to speak the language. Americans are against it. Europeans say, yeah, of course you can do that. And so, Arthur Whaley, of course, got to the story is he gets to the airport to take his first trip to China. And then he turns back and says, I don't want to spoil my China, right? But Americans want to spoil it. So I went in, I guess, in 98 for the first time. And thanks to Zhu Reishi, was able to meet Fang Rujin and Xu Wei and other people there. And they took me around. We went around every day. And it was just so exciting to see some of the places I had read about and to see the scale of the place that you can't really imagine just by looking at a map. And then I remember, and so I had chosen places to visit based on contemporary gazetteers that mentioned old buildings, right? Ming Dynasty buildings, for example. And we were in the middle of Yongkang in a little village called, I think it was called Wenlotsun or something like this. And they had an old 16th century ancestral hall. And I got there and I asked, I said to them, by the way, this was built by the Cheng family back in the 16th century. Chengzi had been a disciple of Wang Yangming. His son became an official, a very successful official. And so I was talking, I met the family, and I said to them, oh, by the way, this is what's your honorable surname? And they said, we're named Cheng. And I said, are you descendants of Chengzi and Cheng Zhengyi back in the Ming Dynasty? And they looked at me and they said, you know our ancestors. and I said, well, yes. And I said, by the way, do you have a genealogy? And they say, yes, we do. We just recompiled it. Would you like to see it? And they put it out. and they turned to the page with Chengzi's biography, and they said, read it out loud. And I proceeded to read it. It was, in literary Chinese. I read it out loud, and they were so impressed. Then they said, would you like to see the portraits of our ancestors?
So you're gradually being led into
and I said,
family secrets. Yeah.
And they sent off some old relatives to pull out a big wooden box which contained portraits of the ancestors, and they would like us to hang them up. And I said, well, the portrait of Chengzi and Chang'e. I'd love to see them. And they, and then I said, I had a question. I said, but I know Cultural Revolution came through here and was very destructive. And I know that people abandoned their genealogies, and genealogies were often burnt. And I know that ancestral portraits were taken away and often burnt. What did you do? Because they had a whole enormous amount of ancestral portraits going back to the Ming. And they said, we knew that would happen, so we hired some painters to paint copies, and we gave the original portraits to our poorest relatives to store under the floor. And when the Red Guards came, we gave them the copies. So this is a family that cares about its heritage, right? And at that point, I said, the students really have to come and look around. How do I get money to pay for the students to come here? And what's the purpose of coming here? So why don't we gather materials for a course to illustrate Chinese history? And when you edit this, you can put some of that URL on, and some of the scenes from this on the into the program. But that was what we did. And also, the students have been in the seminar. I would say that out of that seminar those years, and all the work that students were doing, came 4 or 5 dissertations, a whole bunch of articles, important articles, and we started to build the
good value for money. So I imagine that some of this also had an impact on your own work. That
I would say the being there and seeing the families persuaded me that we really needed to pay attention to family history as part of local history, and that but I would say that it was much more the data-rich part of it had impact on I made use of that in my own work in this new book will be out next year called Localizing Learning, which is about Wuzhou, Jinhua from the 11th century to the end of the 16th. That's sort of an intellectual history of a local place, but also looking at the whole literati enterprise as how a literati community was established in the 12th century, how it changed their values, the rise of Neo-Confucianism, resistance to Neo-Confucianism, and in the end, a turn away from it, and how that all happened by looking. And it's interesting, it turns out you can actually have more than enough materials to do an intellectual history of one place, using only people from that place.
Fascinating. We very much look forward to reading that, because indeed, particularly for Neo-Confucianism, the focus tends to be far broader than that. So beyond that, I imagine, so you said this is coming out next year. So what are the plans or the aspirations for the following years?
So I've made a sort of a life course decision. Look, I've been interested in what happens from the Tang-Sung transition as the beginning of a period in which Neo-Confucianism establishes a new mainstream, to the end of that. In intellectual history, then, the challenges of the late 16th, 17th century to Neo-Confucian hegemony, we might say. And so the book on Neo-Confucianism history tries to get into the Ming Dynasty. The local history book very much is about Yuan and Ming, as well as Southern Song. And I began a number of years ago teaching on the latter half of the 15th century, to answer the following question: what is it about literati, society, and culture in the 15th century, and politics in the 15th century, late 15th century, that makes Wangyang Mingism particularly appealing, right? And so at one point I planned to do a book on the last 50 years of the 15th century into the maybe 1508 or something like this, 1457 to 1508. And so I've taught seminars on it and done a lot of work on it. But I decided that ultimately, given limited time, the 17th century is more interesting, just more interesting. It's not that the 15th century is not unimportant, it is, but relatively speaking is boring. Well, that's not fair to the 15th century, I agree.
Does it have to do with the available material, you think, or is it just
No,
the zeitgeist?
no, the materials are rich. There's lots and lots of material. But there are people who are challenging the system, challenging things in the 15th century, late 15th century. But in the end, I read Wang Yangming as a reaffirmation of the Neo-Confucian project, right? A reaffirmation of it, successful reaffirmation. He saves it, if you will. He doesn't begin as a Neo-Confucian guy. He begins as a literary guy with great ambitions for himself, and a great sense of himself. But in the end, he redefines a way of being a Neo-Confucian, and it has consequences. But in any case, so I will do an article on that, and I've written most of it. But for the next several years, what I really want to do is think about the 17th century and the mixture of Neo-Confucian thinking, late Wangyang Mingism, so to speak, literature, drama, long novels, short stories, new Buddhist revival, the impact of Christianity, or the coming of Christianity and the engagement with with Western knowledge and Western learning that takes place. The one-run entrepreneurs of the time, from people that go from the 17th century to Wang Tingna or Fang Menglong to a Li Yu, Mao Qiling and others, publishers who incorporate great amounts, artists, all the interesting stuff that's going on in art. And then, of course, the appearance of Kao Zhangxue, of evidential learning, and the effort as I read, the more I read Gu Yanwu, the more I think he's looking back and saying, everything you learned in the Ming Dynasty is not true. It's mistaken. Right?
But at the same time, I enjoyed reading He Yuming's book for that reason. That is sort of that you can use Ting criticism to really see what Ming was like. You just have to get rid of the negative tone that's incorporated in that. But if I hear you correctly, it sounds to me like what the 17th century also allows you to do is to write that intellectual history in the broadest sense. That is to look at how things change in just about any area you can imagine. We can conceptualize in any field, and in the 17th century you can see this happening across so many areas.
You got it perfectly. That's it.
Okay.
For greedy people who want to learn new things, the 17th century is ideal. The problem, of course, in working in this period is that there is an enormous amount that's been written about it. And that's highly specialized, right? So, well, in any case,
but that's important to be able to write a broader history, perhaps at the at the
Professor
end
Li Hui and I will start teaching a course together on the 17th century to bring together sort of intellectual history and literary history and see where we go.
Okay. Well, I'm going to switch gears slightly to sort of a broader set of questions just to wrap up the conversation then. We've talked a lot about your plans, but I'm wondering whether you also have any sort of expectations of, or perhaps hopes for, the field of Chinese history. Are there things that you would like to see continue, or perhaps see happen that haven't happened during your career?
So when I began, Chinese history was for most students something that was irrelevant or began only with China's sort of incorporation into the Western view of the globe, right? And it was a history of autocracy, a history of oppression, right? That had to be, gotten rid of. I remember John Fairbank giving a lecture at Princeton when I was a graduate student, saying, not in any way a pro-communist, but saying the communist revolution was necessary to get rid of all that bad old stuff that was China. And Ben Schwartz once said about Fairbank that he was a great modern historian, but when it came to Chinese history, he was a culturalist, right? Anything before the modern. And I think we have to get away from that culturalism. A culturalism, by the way, which is not unique to the West. It's also common to China as well. And see a history of a civilization that develops and changes over time, that is diverse and rich, that gives us things to think about, that is like every civilization, and that's been extraordinary in human history for its ability to maintain the kinds of continuities or to recreate the continuities, to reknit the threads with the past, right? So that today in China, I think there's a sense that China's future must be linked to its past. And how that's going to be done is a big question, but it's not the Xinzhongguo idea, the new China idea of the 1950s, which is the past is now irrelevant because we have a new China, right? It's going to be a China that makes connections. And how people in China do that, how scholars and students in China do that, that's going to be a very interesting topic, but they're going to do it. And it will not be, maybe a consensus will form, maybe it won't, maybe it will be a series of debates. Maybe the current political situation will give way to something radically different. But I guess my hope would be that to recognize Chinese history as filled with change, with diversity, with critical views, and not to try to make it into one single, monotonous, monotone culture, but to hear a plethora of voices, to see, to recognize the polysemy of its history.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very important goal, and it's, to me, it's more relevant than ever. I think in Europe, perhaps even more so, because Chinese history is still not standard in history departments. And to sort of follow up on what you said, I think even those views of Chinese history as somehow, still as the history of autocracy at one point, that too is still with us to some extent. And to me, it's been refreshing to read 18th century readings of Chinese history, because at that point, European readings of Chinese history were vastly different. And it's refreshing for us, I think, at this point, to go back and see what they saw when they first encountered the Chinese past and present of the 18th century. I'll follow up with one sort of bigger question. We talked a little bit about your impressions for the field, but I also wanted to ask you sort of a similar question relating to academia in a broad sense. What have you enjoyed most in academia, having been part of it for over 30 years? What are the things that perhaps could be?
So I've tremendously enjoyed the people I've come to know, both my seniors, my teachers, right, and my colleagues and the students who are now professors themselves, for the most part, that I've had a chance to work with and learn from. Lucky I was to study with Yulao, with the Prince, was transformative. Obviously, working with Bill Peterson and was tremendous. People like Hartwell, but also somebody I didn't mention enough was Bill Skinner, who I realized that we could not do an historical GIS without his support, that anyone who was going to ask for funding for that the funders would necessarily go to him and say, is this a good idea? And so early on I said, Bill, are you going to support this or not? And so he remained involved with it. And in the end, he asked us to take over his digital assets and make them available when he passed away, along with Bill Laveley at Washington. But I was not a student, but I was, it was a great tragedy that his loss, because I really had hoped that he would provide more advice for the China biographical database. And he had told me, he had told me that the thing that he wanted, he thought I really should do is there's this Qing dynasty set of quarterly records on appointments, the Jinshan Lu. He said, you got to get that. You got to get that into the historical database. And in fact, thanks to James Lee's work and Cameron Campbell's work at University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong, we are able to bring that into the database, and that's on its way. So I really should mention Bill Skinner, and working with my colleague, for many years, Michael Fuller, and who remained part of these projects, and from whom I've learned enormous about some literature, from Steve Owen, from people like younger people like Michael Pewitt and Mike Sony, who joined us, Professor Li Hui, and students who've gone on in so many different areas. You, more than anyone, I think, taken some of these ideas, which you had independently, I'd have to say of me, and really started to turn them into important tools for the study of history and literature. That's been Zhu Pingsi, for example, also had an understanding of these before I did at Tsinghua University in Taiwan, also working in these areas. That I just think of all the students, all the different things they've done. And you have to be really proud of them for what they have accomplished. And I just am jealous for all the other universities that have had such good students, and just wish they could have been mine too, so I could have learned more.
Yeah. No, but I think that for many of us, it's also been a great experience to discover that actually being part of this community of students was what made this such a great experience as a graduate student. That you no longer were competing against each other; you were working with each other to realize your own goals, but also some collective.
I think I would say that is. It may be different now for various reasons. I'm not sure. But certainly, for many years, I think the mark of our graduate program was the extraordinary collaborative nature of interaction among students, mutual aid, mutual help, mutual interest. And I think that, well, I won't go on into why I think that it has changed, but I think it has to do with the broader culture, but also with new fields in contemporary, bringing in students who don't necessarily have shared the same interest. So with the decrease in jobs, I think that things become more competitive in unfortunate ways.
And the way higher education is being managed may also be.
Yes, and of course, yeah, in the past, you could be a student for as long as you wanted to. And now you get... I never understood.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So anything else you would like to add before we wrap up?
I have no idea what I could say anymore.
Okay. No, I think it's been a lovely time. I think we should probably wrap up at this point. Thank you very much, Peter, for taking the time for this conversation. This was really fun. And thanks again also to Maddalena Poli for setting up this series of conversations. It's bye from me for now, and bye from Peter as well.
Yeah, thank you.